In this video, you're going to learn how to use Luminance Range Masks in Lightroom. Before we go into demonstration mode, what I'd like to do is take a few minutes just to kind of discuss the Luminance Range, talk about what they are, where to find them in Lightroom, and some of the specific details about how to create a Luminance Range and work with some of the different sliders. And then the second part of this video, we'll go into doing some demonstrations showing or illustrating several different ways you can create luminance range masks. So a luminance range mask is used to adjust specific areas of an image based on brightness levels. So they're used to isolate highlights, midtones, or shadows in your photos. They are great for working with high contrast scenes where you need to fine-tune dynamic range of a photo, or perhaps to enhance details in bright or dark regions. For example, you might want to reduce the exposure of the sky, but sometimes you have trees or people that are protruding over the horizon, and those at times are included in the mask that gets created. And so you can use a luminance slider to effectively highlight just the areas of the sky based on a luminance value or luminance range, and exclude something that might be poking above the horizon. And there are many other ways that you can use luminance ranges as well. All right, so there are multiple ways that you can create a luminance range mask. Ultimately, the way that you create a luminance range mask kind of depends on your personal preferences. When I go into demonstration mode, I'll illustrate several different ways that you can create these. One way to create a luminance range mask is to simply click points on your photo. And when you're clicking points, essentially whatever the luminance value is at the point that you click, what it'll do is isolate other areas in the photo that have that same luminance value. So that's one way of doing it. You can also drag a box to encompass a range of luminance values. So all you're doing there is just dragging a rectangle on the screen, and then it essentially takes all of the luminance values that are within that rectangle or box and highlights or includes in the mask that gets created the values that fall within that box that you're drawing. And then alternatively, you can also simply use the sliders directly. You can push the sliders left or right to remove shadows or remove highlights. And you also have a secondary smoothness slider that allows you to feather the mask that ultimately gets created. So we'll examine some of these different methods on the upcoming slides, and then of course I'll do a demonstration as well. All right, so let's talk first about the slider itself. The slider can be moved left to right or right to left. If you start on the left-hand side of the slider and begin moving it to the right, what that will do is it will remove shadows from the mask. If you move right to left, then it removes highlights. And we're illustrating both of these on this slide. So in the screenshot on the left-hand side of my slider, you'll notice that we've moved the slider from right to left. And what that's doing in the mask that gets created is it's removing highlighted areas. So you can see the areas of the sky, and there's probably some atmospheric effect that is hovering above the mountains as well in the background. And this is a cemetery, so some of the headstones, some of the ground areas have been removed. Those are the lighter areas, right? They're the highlighted areas. And because we are moving this from right to left, what we're doing is we're removing those brightness areas from the mask that gets created, right? And so the further you move this from right to the left, the more of the lighter or luminance values wind up getting removed. Now, if you go the opposite way, if you move your slider from left to right, like we're doing on the screenshot on the right-hand side of the screen, you're doing the opposite there. So you're actually removing the shadows or the dark areas from the mask that gets created. So you can see that in this case, we've moved our slider pretty far from right to left. And so things like a lot of the trees and some of the shrubbery and some of the outlines of this fence, those have been excluded from the mask that gets created. All right, so that's using those sliders directly to create the mask. Now, of course, as we'll see later, you can also click points, or you can drag a rectangle to initiate the initial creation of that luminance range mask as well. And on top of this, there are some secondary sliders that you need to be aware of, which we'll talk about, that allows you to kind of feather the mask that gets created. All right, so again, you can also click points on the image. We can see this in the screenshot on the upper right or upper right hand corner of the slide on my screen at this point. So in this case, we've selected or clicked a point over this farm implement that's sitting in the field, and it's a relatively dark area. And so as soon as you click that point, whatever luminance value is associated with that point, any other areas in the photo that share that luminance value are going to be included in the mask. And so you can see some of the darker areas in the sky, in the background. This little hill part of that has been added as part of the mask. The entire farm implement has been included. Some of the grassy areas, the fence posts, right? So all that's been included because it's been identified as being the same luminance value as the point that I clicked on the photo. Alternatively, you can also draw a rectangle. So you'll notice in the screenshot at the bottom, we're drawing a rectangle here. And what it will do in this case is all the luminance range values found within that rectangle that I'm drawing, right? It's going to use those to select or to create my luminance range mask that gets created. Right? So it's the same idea as clicking a point, only difference being here that it's using the range of values that are found within that rectangle. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about that range slider because it can be used at any time. And remember, you've got sliders on either end, right? You've got a shadow slider on the left that, as you move it from left to right, is going to remove areas of shadow or darkness. And on the right-hand side, you have your highlight slider. And so as you move that highlight slider from right to left, you begin to exclude light areas or highlighted areas. Now, it's a little hard to see here, but there's actually a second set of sliders on either side known as the smoothest sliders. We'll talk about that at this point. So with your smoothest sliders, the smoothest slider controls the feathering between the masked and unmasked areas, and it allows for a smoother transition between different luminance levels. A higher smoothness value results in more gradual transitions, making the effect more subtle and blended. And a lower smoothness value creates a sharper transition between the masked and unmasked areas, making the effect more pronounced. Right? So those smoothness sliders, you really don't see them until you move either the shadow or the highlight slider, and then you see them. And then at that point, they can be moved using your mouse or your trackpad left or right as well. But the whole idea here is you're introducing a feathering approach so that you can control how gradual or how subtle that mask ultimately is that gets created. All right, so that's going to bring us to the end of this first section. Then the next section of this demonstration, I'll go into some of the specifics of how you use the different tools that are available to you to create a luminance range mask. All right, so in the next part of this demonstration, what I'm going to do is illustrate how to create a luminance range mask by either clicking a point on the photo or by drawing or dragging a rectangle on the photo. The way you initiate this, again, is just to go to the Create New Mask pane, go to Range, Luminance Range, and then from there, we'll just kind of illustrate clicking a point first. So for example, if I click on part of the cloud, and all I'm doing is just using my cursor or my trackpad just to click a point, and as soon as you do that, whatever point you've clicked, the luminance value that's associated with that point ultimately gets selected. Now there is a range here, so you'll notice that if you look over on your luminance range slider, it is, essentially giving you some additional options here for updating or making changes to the luminance range mask that was created simply by clicking the point, because there is a bit of a range selection that goes on when you're clicking a point. And so from here, you can update your mask just, as we saw earlier in the demo, by clicking either the smoothness slider or by moving the highlight or shadow slider as well. So you do have the ability to alter the effect of that mask or where the mask gets created just by using the sliders. So just because you've clicked a point doesn't mean that you're stuck with whatever it's identified as a mask for that point. All right, you do have the ability to update that mask as needed. All right, so that's clicking a point to define the luminance range mask. Now, keep in mind, you can also drag a rectangle to do this. So Let me just delete the existing mask and then recreate it. So in this case, rather than clicking a point, if you draw a rectangle, and it can be large or small, just kind of depends on what you're trying to accomplish here. Essentially, though, you're dragging a rectangle and then releasing, and then same idea, right? There, it's taking whatever was in that the rectangle that I just drew. Any luminance values that were within that rectangle are then used to select other areas in the photo that share that range. And again, this can be updated, right? So you can always come over to your luminance range slider and use the smoothness slider to make updates to the mask that gets created by pushing this left or right. All right, or of course you can move this left to right as well. So you do have a lot more control over what ultimately gets created. All right. So again, the three ways that you would define your luminance range mask: you can either click a point on the photo, you can drag a rectangle on the photo, or you don't have to do either of those, right? You could simply use the slider, both of the sliders there, the shadow slider, the highlight slider, as well as the smoothness sliders. You could simply use those sliders without ever actually clicking the photo to define what your mask will be ultimately. A lot of times you're going to use a combination of things, right? You might start out by dragging a rectangle and then of course altering that to some degree to refine what your mask will ultimately look like. Anyway, so hopefully this was helpful. Again, this whole series of videos that I'm doing is covering the different types of masks that you can create, and hopefully you're finding these helpful. Our next video in the series will go over creating color range masks, which are in some ways similar to a luminance range, but dealing more with colors instead of brightness values. So, appreciate you joining me for this video, and we'll see you again next time.